So just a quick reminder before we kick off today. I mentioned this very briefly last week. I have to catch a flight after today's class, so we might finish. Not we might. We will finish a little bit earlier, right? Just so I don't have to run to Pierre Elliott Trudeau Airport, which is never a fun thing to do. So we'll finish a little bit earlier. We'll obviously take the time to do what we can. But if not, well, we'll have done some things. I got a few emails also, just a bit of housekeeping before we get into the two short stories for today. Hello. Right on time. So before we get into the short stories and the general topic for today, I got a few emails just asking for clarification about the essay and what some of my expectations are, right? I think I divided up the points properly so that it comes out to how much the final is worth. If not, I'll just kind of adjust it. You can let me know. But yeah, so what I expect for a final paper, right, 6 to 8 pages, is a broad approximation, right? If you write 5.5 pages, right, or 5 pages, but they're really solid 5 pages, right, that's fine. Okay, I much prefer a good essay, right, that actually has interesting points that it's making, over an essay that forces itself to be long just to fit into the actual guidelines. Okay, so 6 to 8 is very much an approximation here. And yeah, it should be on one of the texts or broad topics that we covered in class. Okay. I mentioned this to some people, but I'll remind you of it here. If you absolutely want to cover a different text than one that we covered in this semester, right? Maybe for whatever reason, none of the texts spoke to you, right? You have no ideas about any of the texts. That happens. It's rare, but it happens. I am somewhat open for you to actually choose a different text, but you'll have to get it approved by me first, right? Mostly it's for texts that you can justify as being part of our broad theme, right? At least a 20th or 21st century text at the very least, but obviously just something that you can justify as being part of our theme. Yeah, and as I mentioned last week, you can totally ask me for feedback as you write, right? I understand the frustration of going down an idea and then it arriving nowhere, right? So if you're not sure about an idea or not sure about how you're actually approaching it, send me an email, right? Say, like, this is what I have so far. Is this something that's worth exploring, right? Can I actually go down this path? Yes, right? Do it if you have any hesitations whatsoever. Right? That is absolutely a part of my job, and I'm happy to help you navigate, right, the writing of this final essay. And just as a general point, right, a lot of the questions that we raised in class can be used as good, essay jumping off points. This I mentioned again last week. And yeah, if you want a rough breakdown of how I'm going to be grading this, unless someone tells me otherwise, I think the final is on 30, right? It's worth 30% of the final grade, unless I'm mistaken. Someone can fact check me on that. But yeah, most of it, like I mentioned, is in the analysis. Right? Analysis and writing, which, again, tracks. If you write something clear and coherent, you've got most of the points, right? I did put like a solid 5 points on the thesis statement itself, right? That you actually have a core argument that is able to withstand your analysis. But that's why I consider analysis as like the major part here, because you can kind of clump in analysis and thesis together, even though they're slightly separate. Yeah. That's up to you. That's a style choice, but I would say no more than 2, right? It depends what you want to argue, right? If you want to argue, for example, or write an essay about what the difference is between classic weird and new weird, right? And you want to compare, I don't know, H.P. Lovecraft and Mieville, that can work. I wouldn't say more than 2 just because of the length of the essay itself, right? If you start going into more than 2, you kind of start to lose track of page number, or if you do keep it within the page number, you kind of often short shift one of the texts. So I would say no more than 2, right? But that's just a personal recommendation in this case. So that kind of fits in with the research part, right? Like if you, and here again, I'm flexible on this, right? I don't require a specific number of sources, right? I'm not requiring you to have like absolutely 5 sources or anything like that. But wherever they're necessary, so for example, if you make a claim about an author, right, you can't just pull that out of nowhere, right? You have to have like an interview that the author did where they make that claim about themselves or something like that, or another analysis that finds it. So yeah, basically do your due diligence. That's the 5 points there. Some of the texts I do acknowledge you might have more difficulty finding information, right? So if you choose to write about fake plastic trees, for example, the Caitlin Kiernan text, you might have to be a little bit more creative in what secondary sources you find, just because I don't think there's a lot on her as far as secondary sources are concerned, right? So you might need to find some angle that's a little bit different, or secondary sources about stories that are similar to Caitlin Kiernan's and kind of like add on through that. But most of the text that we've covered, you should be able to find, quite a bit of secondary material, right? So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay, cool. And of course, this is pretty standard for English papers, but please use MLA guidelines, right? A lot of you have used MLA guidelines pretty easily in your reviews, right? So I'm not too worried. It's just as a casual reminder. And if you're unsure about anything, it's all online, right? Like I can link it if you want in Studium, but the OWL Purdue website has literally everything you need to know about the MLA and its structure. Any other questions about this? Okay, fantastic. Has anyone actually started writing their final essay? I would be shocked, like genuinely shocked if someone did, but sometimes there are people who do. Okay, no. So, I'm sure for those of you who have read the short stories for today, you are well aware of what our broad theme is, right? Even if you didn't look at the syllabus, or if you didn't pay attention to the actual title of today's slide. So we will be taking a bit of a look at how certain feminist writers, or writers, right? Angela Carter would be pretty much a feminist. How feminist writers have approached the concept of weird fiction, right? Because it does actually offer itself quite a bit, right down to its roots, to the topic of weird fiction. Yeah, I am kind of curious. Do I ask this question now? No, I'll ask it later, right? I have a question in the back of my mind, but I'll ask it later. So we will kind of let it go. So last week we talked about China Mieville. Last 2 weeks we talked about China Mieville, right? And if we'll recall, we kind of started our class with him as well. We're not going to continue on with him. I don't think it's necessary to address him in the context of feminist criticism here. Although I do think he would be sympathetic to those movements. But if you'll recall, right, the first text that I asked you to read, rather unsuccessfully, right, The Efficacy of a Worm-Eaten Dictionary, if you recall, 10 weeks ago, it started off, or at least part of the text began with a meditation on the word weird, right? And he kind of modified it into worm and worm-eaten and so on and so forth, right? He was kind of doing a bit of a linguistic exercise with the word weird. But it actually does fit in quite nicely as a term, right? Both historically and in the way that we use it today with feminist criticism and just feminist concerns broadly, right? Um, and I'm curious if anyone actually knows, right? Because this was not mentioned in the original article that I'm referencing from way back in week one. Does anyone actually know what weird refers to, right? Like the original WYRD. It's an Old English word, which, if anyone actually speaks Old English here, that's the only time it's useful is when your professor asks you obscure questions, right? Does anyone actually know what it refers to at its origin? I'll give you a hint. It actually relates to the image that I have up, right? Which some of you may be astute enough to know what that image is. Going once, going twice. Yeah, Mia? Fate. Fate, not faith. Faith being, did you say faith or fate? Oh, fate. Sorry, then I misunderstood faith. Yeah, fate, right? That is what it means in Old English, right? At its core, fate, destiny, right? We kind of intertwine the two, but obviously there is somewhat of a difference between fate and destiny. Um, but that's how the Old English populations, or the populations that would have spoken Old English like 1,200 years ago, 1,300 years ago, would have used the term weird, right? Eventually, it kind of came to mean to not just fate in general as a concept, but actually being able to control your fate, right? And of course, that's where we get things like these figures here, right? Who are, does anyone know? Three women with a loom. Anyone see the old Disney movie Hercules? Yeah. No one wants to take a shot? Yeah, go ahead, Mia. Yeah, the fates. Good. Yeah, that's it. It's just the fates. Sometimes the three fates, right? If people want to be pedantic about it, but yeah, the fates, right? Um, and so what you kind of start to see in a really interesting way in a lot of ancient or just older communities and civilizations, whether it's the Greeks here who had the fates or the Old English who used the word weird to mean fate or destiny, is that you start to see throughout time the association of fate and destiny with feminine figures, right? And bonus points for whoever can tell me are the most famous feminine figures that have the word weird associated to them. You should know this as literary scholars. Who's the most famous English writer of all time? Great. Who's their character that name which characters are named weird or associated with weirdness? Yeah, well, okay, yes. A lot of them. But like explicitly so in the play that should not be named. Yeah. Yeah, Macbeth. Good. The three sisters, right? The three witches. They're also called the Weird Sisters. Okay? It's not a coincidence, right? Shakespeare did not have much of an education as far as we would know. He basically had the equivalent of what you would receive by grade 5 here. But he was not stupid, right? He explicitly had the Weird Sisters, which I should have gotten an image up, um, called the way that they are or associated with the term weird because he was aware of this association both of feminine figures with fate and destiny, but also the meaning of the word weird, right? Which Shakespeare was not so far removed from Old English that it wouldn't have necessarily been a part still of the vernacular of the time, right? Um, and so you start to see, even if weird as we know it today is not associated with fate, right? A lot of the texts that we've read in class throughout the semester have not really been concerned with destiny, so to speak, right? On some level, yes. For example, last week we talked about prophecy, right? And how prophecies came slightly true in the form of Kraken. Maybe a little bit of Poe addresses the concept of fate and destiny. If you want to go back to something like the fall of the House of Usher. Um, but by and large, right, we, as a 21st century population, tend to not understand weird as specifically associated with fate. But it does give an entryway into a lot of women writers to actually approach this topic in a way that goes into deep-seated historical roots, right? And I think that's particularly interesting to consider, right? Especially if you want to think about Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, right? There is a specifically historical component to that story. And, that's something that you can maybe think about in relation to this tale. Maybe less so with Joanna Russ's story, but, maybe not. Yeah, and just to kind of add on to this in a really in a more explicit manner, right, as it pertains to literature, as I mentioned here, what you start to see in a lot of early women's fiction, right, is an explicit concern with the supernatural, right? Um, women have been telling stories for as long as stories have been told, right? But when supernatural fiction or just non-normative literary fiction, right, fiction concerned with ghosts and ghouls and the otherworldly started to emerge, women were absolutely at the forefront of that kind of movement, right? The obvious example being Frankenstein, right? But even something, and we're going to come back to her, which is why I'm bringing her up. Even a writer like Austen, even if she doesn't explicitly write about the supernatural, she does in a lot of her texts kind of raise these metaphorical specters, right? And this is not, again, a coincidence. It would have been part of a lot of people's conceptions, socially or otherwise, of the types of stories that women would have been concerned with. Right? And again, I'm giving the examples of Austen and Shelley, of Mary Shelley here. But if we go back hundreds of years, you also see this in the 16th, 15th, 14th centuries, right? All the way back, you see this association of women writers and the supernatural, right? Or the overnatural, perhaps, or outside of the natural. Yeah. Now, I guess my question, right, to you, specifically as it concerns the weird, right, as we've been defining it throughout this class, right, not in the historical sense that I brought it up. Why do you think the weird as a genre might attract a lot of women writers, right? Like, think of how we've been defining it, both in its traditional sense and its more contemporary sense. What does it offer that women writers might be concerned with, or feminist writers, perhaps? It's not always the same thing. Some women are not feminists, but why would it be something that might be of interest? What does weird fiction offer as a playing ground? Uh-huh.
Needed and a state of confusion, yep. And like they're disturbed in life because of a certain thing, and I think maybe historically speaking, women have been like in that space, or can relate to being in that space of not being a part of like the real thing and having forces like going against them.
Right, so it's a space outside of quote unquote normative society, right? And when I say quote unquote normative, right, it's often historically been, right, male society. So yeah, there's absolutely that level. I think that's really good. Does anyone want to add on to that? Francesca?
Imagination of other possibilities.
What do you mean? What do you mean by other possibilities?
Well,
because isn't that just fiction?
Yeah, that's true.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying push your idea further here because it is a good idea. Mm-hmm. But Does anyone want to add on to the idea of possibilities? I think it's a good one before I give like the answer here. What kind of possibilities does weird fiction offer that other types of fiction doesn't necessarily offer? Yeah, exactly. Right. It is a much more, at least in the fictional sense of the term, right? It is a much more radical, or the possibilities, right, are much more out there, right? The imagination compared to other types of fiction can be let loose a lot more flexibly, right, than any other types of fiction. If you pick up new um, your new book by Nicholas Sparks, right, at Barnes and Nobles, right? This is a terrible example. I don't know why I chose him. But it's like I was just trying to think of a really popular author, and that's the first thing that came to mind. Um, you you wouldn't necessarily imagine the worlds or the possibilities that an author like that would bring up, right? Compared to the worlds of weird fiction, right, in which anything is literally possible, right? The the possibilities in the literal sense of the term that you're bringing up, Francesca, are much more available to writers of the weird, and this is something that um, women writers have been traditionally quite interested in, and as we'll see, right, this also fits in with some of the other concerns that we've been talking about, or other perspectives that we've been talking about in this class. Um, it's the same reason why a lot of marginalized communities, right, racially speaking, or as far as sexuality is concerned, right, that's why weird fiction is also quite attractive to writers of those communities, perhaps, um, or even political outsiders, right, might be attracted to it for similar reasons. Put a pin in that, by the way, because we will be coming back to that as far as women writers and feminism is concerned. Right? Um, Before I move on into like feminist literary theory as a concept, right? Are we all good on this? Like, does anyone have any questions or anything we want to add on to this? Um, okay. I just realized that I forgot to actually put the questions that I usually put on when were like the broader questions, so I'll probably modify the PowerPoint a little bit later. But I have questions where the other stories are concerned, so that's good. Okay. Now, you kind of, Maimuna, brought up this question tangentially, right? But I am rather curious, ladies in the audience, and guys, don't feel left out. I'm going to ask you a question a little bit later, a different question. Um, how many of you here would actually consider yourselves feminists? Right, just show of hands. How many of you would actually consider yourself feminists? Okay.
To me, now or like it's not the same thing. That's a specific.
No, I don't. Because there's a deliberate point why I'm being like more general here, right? Because I'll ask you, why do you? Well, let's start with you. Why would you consider that a slippery question? Mm-hmm. Good. Mm-hmm.
Stuff about feminism now that I don't align with.
Good.
That people like 30 years ago also wouldn't align with feminism. So you have to be specific. It's like such a big word that like can come like it has so many. It's like a big circle
Yeah.
of like ideas. You can't just ask a question without like providing like a background.
With that statement made, and I do agree with it, do you consider yourself in the 21st century as a student in Canada, right? In this very specific moment and place and time, would you consider yourself a feminist? Okay, good. We'll come back to that. I mean, you seemed also to have like a maybe hand go up. Is it for the same reasons? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Because like I think like the ideas and everything is like in the right place,
Mhm.
and I do agree on stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't think I do enough, like thinking. Like I don't really, yeah, I don't do enough for me to really be to claim that I really am a feminist.
Okay, so like conceptually you agree with the ideas, but it has to come with a certain like practice and action.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. The four other women in the audience, you pretty much raised your hand in this case. We'll just keep going from Francesca all the way to Milezi. Why would you say yes?
Well, I would consider myself an intersectional feminist.
We'll come back to that, but yeah. Uh-huh.
And I, I, try to also be an ally to other communities when it's needed, and listen to what they have to say, and yeah.
So more of an intersectional feminist, but also associated with, when you say ally, you mean like queer communities, for example?
Yeah,
Okay.
other communities, other communities as well.
Okay. Aya?
I believe that I'm a feminist. I think that we should not so much focus on the proportions and implication it has taken in the modern day, and just focus on the focal grounding of what feminism stands for and what its aims are, which is the rights for women. And I think it's, in my opinion, it's as simple as that. No one has to see how, nowadays, there's no a single social justice movement that only has one perspective. They've all taken they've all taken over. They all have different perspectives, different angles, which are looking every year. So I think that the principal grounding of feminism is just the rights of women. So naturally, I consider myself feminist.
And I think that ties in a really interesting way. Both of your answers tie into perhaps what is stopping Maimuna from maybe considering herself fully a feminist, right? Is this intersectional or perhaps, more branching out of a lot of feminist movements. Am I correct in kind of saying that? Or maybe? It's fine if no. I'm just trying to make some connections. Mia, how about you? Why yes?
Hard to explain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can get into this
Mm-hmm.
and whether you agree or not. And then I like to say Francesca, I'm more like an intersectional feminism. And I agree with the white rich feminism. That's how it started.
Uh-huh.
Because it started to be niche trans women.
Yeah.
For a long time, it only included white women and straight women. I don't agree with that. Why? So I'm interested to know
Maimuna?
what she said about when you don't want to be contemporary feminism.
Yeah.
I do think it has evolved into something different and better, and I don't always agree with both the ideas.
Do you want to take a minute to answer that, or do you want to think about it before answering?
What do you not agree with in contemporary feminism?
I think people use it sometimes to, I'm not gonna say justify, but they use it, they say anti-feminist and feminist, and they say things that are just that if you really look into it, it's not exactly feminist. I don't want to give examples because
I get what you're saying.
but it's just sometimes I don't know,
People use the term without actually reflecting, right, those values, you mean? Or
yeah, but it's more when I'm looking at stuff online, or I'm scrolling on Instagram or whatever, and I see posts about I don't know, a situation in the US about something that happened to a woman. Then I'll read the comments, and it's a bunch of people defending whatever happens to the woman, which I'm for, obviously, I'm not protection for all women. But sometimes it's just the way that they articulate their responses and the things that they say and the ways that they're made. I don't
Yeah, I get that.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if that's examples, like actual examples, because it's like, I don't, yeah, I just don't wanna, I get what you're saying, but it's, and I feel like just because feminism, it's like it's been like a word that's existed a long time in history, and it has had like different meanings and like different reasons, etc. So I think that word is really way too big to like define. And I just can't, like, I would have to consider everything that's like happened under that big umbrella for me to say like, oh, I align with each points when I don't. It's just what I think. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
I think it makes sense. I don't know. Yeah. Before we get too far out, by the way, Sue, hello. I asked the question, do you consider yourself a feminist? And I was just asking for justification as to why or why not. So, Minidzi, go ahead.
I'm thinking.
Yeah. It's not, again, it's not an easy question, so it's more, yeah.
Yeah. As I'm okay with a lot of ideas from this movement, but sometimes there is some extreme ideas in this movement that I'm not always okay with. Because as a woman, I want to be treated equally as men. I want to be respected, to be taken seriously. But I don't think that as women we're superior to. I mean, we're equal. We should kind of complete each other in a certain way, and there shouldn't be like women. Men always have been superior. No, it's time for women. No, I don't think this is it. But it should be like trying to find a middle ground where everyone is treated equally.
It's a nice expression of that. Sue?
I definitely consider myself a feminist. I think my perception of feminism is very different from like American feminism. I come from a South Asian background, and I think just up until like my grandmother's like era, they wouldn't eat at the same time as like my granddad did.
Yep.
And so we've come like there's still so much progress to be done. Like where I'm from, like in Bangladesh, you can't find out the gender of your child. It's like illegal to find out the gender just because there's so much feminicide, like baby girl feminicide. So there's like a big progress to do. Obviously, I believe because I grew up here, I'm lucky that my idea of feminism is like complete parity and for everyone to be able to express what their sexual orientation is freely. But I think that feminism isn't just that. There's like a whole other idea of feminism that we should also consider when we talk feminism.
Okay. Thank you for all those, I think, complex and very good answers. Guys, I told you you would not be left out in this question. It'll be a slight variation on this question. Do you think you can be considered feminists as guys? Right? How many of you, just raise your hand, do you think can be called feminists? Okay. 2 out of 4, 2.5. Yeah, not sure. Okay, we'll go in the opposite direction, right, Liam, and then we'll come down. Yeah.
I can be considered a feminist.
Okay. Why?
Just because yeah, you speak too much joke.
Okay.
Feminism is agreement. A lot of women, not a lot of my job.
Yeah.
Not yeah, I'm not really into it. When someone talks, I say, yeah, that's it.
So you don't have necessarily that engagement enough to be considered, right, a feminist. Carlos?
I'm sharing the same idea, feelings with Liam, but I might consider myself feminist because I want to like women. I didn't know that there was a whole concept of feminism. Like I was really not aware about that. I only thought it was only like equal between men and women, that women have more. But the same rights as men.
Yeah.
But I didn't know there was more into that.
Good.
So at this point, I don't know where I stand by.
Okay. Like, did you find out like just now that
Yeah,
it might?
because-
Oh, okay. I mean, again, if you learned one thing from this class, I guess it's like diversity of opinions. That's great. Okay, so maybe a reconsideration here. Yeah, it's good.
I don't know, but I saw an interview that and the accent says, like, if you believe that men and women should equal, be treated equal, you are feminist.
Okay.
In that sense, I'm maybe feminist, but I don't actually do anything for it, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And last but not least, maybe.
I'm not sure I exactly understand specific feminism, but I struggle with some concept of equality between women and men, and is for example when applying for the job position and breaking those certain requests.
Yeah.
And in the point I agree with if this is a part of feminism, I agree with the point.
Okay.
And I should know more about the broad concept of feminism if I exactly make my mind to whether or not I should be considered feminist or not.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I like that. At least all the answers at the very least that were given in this class, right, do kind of get at what's already problematic with just what I've called this slide, right? Capital F feminism and literature, right? Which maybe would have been a good title up until about the 60s, right? Maybe, right? And even then it would have been problematic just by the fact that of its assumption, right? And I think that, yeah, I think it was you, Mia, in your answer, you kind of brought up the idea that, well, a lot of you brought up actually, the idea that there are different strands, right, of feminism that have emerged. And even when we kind of generally understand the idea of feminism, we tend to categorize it into like broad waves, right? At least speaking here from a North American perspective, which I'll broadly stick to, not because it's the best perspective necessarily, but because it's the one that fits most with the literature that we're talking about today, which is North American literature. But yeah, like even in the context of North American feminism, right? Whenever we categorize, first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism, or fourth wave now, fifth, I forget, to be honest. I've heard some people say fourth, fifth. Yeah, the point remains, right, that even these broad categorizations, right, do lead to a rather slippery slope, right? Perhaps because they're broad categorizations. Broadly speaking, when we consider here in North America first wave feminism, who can tell me what we generally think of, right? What were the aims of first wave feminism? Francesca and then Aya. Okay, what were the suffragettes doing? Okay, good. Votes. Aya? Okay, good. So bare fundamentals, just the right to vote, right? And I think the addition here of white women already complicates that perspective, right? Because what you saw, right, is already from this so-called first wave, right, is divisions within the movement itself, right? A lot of these first wave feminists did not want black men to vote, for example, because it meant that a racialized minority would get rights before them, right? Or the implication of women voting at the time, right, was property owning women, right? So women that actually had a certain amount of money, right? So when you were talking, Mia, earlier about rich white women, right, that was explicitly that type of movement. That's not to say that they're, aims were inherently bad, right? Women should have the right to vote. Hot take, obviously, right? But the perspectives that people take on this moment can already be very much complicated, right? And even in the methods, right, that these women actually used, right? We were talking about how contemporary feminist movements might be a little bit difficult to understand or agree with, but this is something that goes back hundreds of years, right? Very few people know, right, that the suffragettes that we're talking about, a lot of them set bombs, right? They wanted, the actual right to vote and did so through potentially violent action, right? Breaking windows, blowing up mailboxes, right? Things that a lot of feminists disagreed with at that time. So even already in the moment, there was a lot of disagreement with what it meant to be a feminist. Right? So I do find it rather interesting that a lot of your kind of responses were centered around the idea of like, well, I agree with one branch, but not necessarily as a whole. It's kind of complicated to answer. And you're correct. I think it's a very good reflex to have is to question, right, how you want to consider yourself or what approach you want to take to this issue of women's equality. But it is also very interestingly being a question that has been asked for hundreds of years, right? And it's something that shouldn't be forgotten. Even in second wave feminism, right? One of the things that you start to see is what Francesca, you were mentioning, right? What we call intersectionality, right? Who can tell me, or maybe you want to tell us what exactly that means, right? Or someone else can mention what intersectionality kind of means. Yeah, go ahead, Maimuna.
I'm really bad at explaining things. You have to consider somebody's like experiences as a whole in order to understand them or define them. So,
yeah, I think that's a pretty good definition that we can work with. And it's not an exclusively feminist concern, right? There's all kinds of theorists and thinkers that have considered themselves intersectional, right? It's the idea of bringing multiple perspectives or coming to understand multiple perspectives together, right? You can't just take the issue of gender, right? Of being a woman, right? If that the idea of being a woman in society, you also have to consider class, right? You also have to consider race. You also have to consider, a million other factors, right? People who are not women, right? The men who are either allies or opponents, right? There's all kinds of factors that you kind of have to come into play with. And on the surface, right, such an approach, such an intersectional approach would seem to try to compensate for the lacks, right, in first wave feminism, right, that didn't necessarily take into account women of color, right, or poor women or any other type of perspective here. And yet there were still lacks in what we broadly consider second wave, right? One of the major advocates, or not advocates, one of the major issues, right, that a lot of women were fighting for was the right to work, right? I want a job, right? I want to be able to, be a sales manager at Kohl's or whatever, right? I want to work outside the house. I want to be more than a stay-at-home mom, right? Which, again, seems like a pretty reasonable thing to want to do, right? I want to earn my own money. Okay, great. And yet, as one of the most excellent feminist critics, Bell Hooks, has pointed out, Black women were already doing that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? So you, in wanting to be an intersectional thinker, are immediately bucking up against an issue that has been concerning women of color, for example, for decades at this point, right? And so there's already this kind of dissociation that occurs throughout feminist history, again, at least from the North American perspective that I'm broadly taking here. And yet, the idea of a feminist literary theory, right, is one that continues to interest people throughout the decades, right? It really did emerge with the 1960s onward, right? People were taking up the ideas of French thinker Simone de Beauvoir and applying them to the literary world, right? Seeing how literature reinforced certain patriarchal standards, right? Or how women could use literature in order to advance their aims, right, as feminists. Okay? And in that sense, you can broadly understand a feminist literary theory, right, that can kind of encompass a lot of the issues that, whether you agree with them or not, can be broadly understood as feminist in the sense that they concern women's rights, right? And yet, right, despite the fact that it's something that continues to be used as a term, one of the things that's really interesting, I think, in contemporary feminist literary theory, right, is exactly what you brought up. The idea that it's actively starting since the 90s, we'll say more actively starting to take more intersectional approaches to issues that we've sometimes already raised in class, right? I'm just going to take a sip of water because I'm starting to get thirsty. So yeah, one of the things that some of the things that we started to raise in class. A few weeks ago, when we were talking about the willows and fake plastic trees, do we remember the painting that we brought that I showed up on the screen? The Venus painting. Do we broadly remember that one? Yeah. Okay. Right. So, do we remember what I said about that painting or what it kind of broadly represented? No. Yeah, the Venus painting. Why did I bring it up? Right, what was the point of it? Why does it relate to this that we're talking about now? Or you could just imagine it in your mind and try to think of why it might be important now. I can bring it up also if people want to have a quick reminder. Yeah. Okay, but why does it matter to this context that we're talking about here? Do we remember what I was saying about it? About the representation of women? Right? What was I saying? Sue, you're nodding yes. What was I saying? Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What did I bring up in relation to this? Yeah, and he. Or you're scrolling through your notes. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Subject of admiration
Uh-huh.
and like you're like admiring a very specific like an organized form,
Uh-huh.
which is not like naturally occurred.
Yeah. So there's very much like that's a central feminist concern, is that absolutely right? Idealizing a very specific type of woman, right? And again, this is not relatively new, right, to society. Was some of the first art that we found of just humanity as a broad civilization, right, is of women goddesses, right? You can argue that that's a form of idealization of what a woman's body should look like, right? So on the one hand, there's absolutely that, right? Botticelli imagining, literally, right, making a god figure out of women's figures, right? But remember what I said, right? Where is she positioned? What's around her? What is she on? What's the association that's being made here? Some of you actually wrote about it in your midterm exam.
Was it
Yeah.
about like symbols of passiveness and beauty?
Okay. Yeah. Symbols of passiveness and beauty. Yeah, good. Okay, the natural thing, right? But yeah, it's associated in that sense, right? So I brought it up in the context of women being often in art or literature, and being associated with natural beauty, which you raised, Minhee, but also, right, it implies a certain conception of nature that is akin to how we tend to conceive women, at least in the Western world, right? Passive, being able to be exploited, often for the purposes of childbearing and so on, right? Um, and so, from an intersectional feminist perspective, right, to come back to this, right, we have the emergence starting in the 80s of what we call ecofeminism, right? So already we have a little bit more of a precision there, right? Wanting to argue that not just what I just said here, but how we actually can see these types of constructions in literature, or how we can, again, utilize literature to maybe construct new forms of conceptions of nature and woman, or both, right, together or separate. Um, we have all kinds of debates, right, that have emerged again since the 70s or 80s or 90s about what it is, right, to construct a specific type of body, right, both male and female. And of course, what's really interesting about that is that it led to the emergence of what we now broadly call queer studies, right? Because that's a central concern of, right, a lot of queer theorists and queer perspectives, right, is how to understand certain bodies, certain forms, certain genders, sexual orientations, and so on, right? In terms that go way beyond simply feminist discourse, right? So a lot of the relevance that we still have in the contemporary moment of feminist literary theory, right, is not just in how it is still relevant to a lot of women today, as evidenced by the fact that most of you do consider yourself at least some kind of feminist, even if it's not quite precise what kind. So there is still obviously very much a concern. But what's particularly fascinating is also how it's led to the emergence of completely unthinkable, a few decades ago, perspectives on literature and humanity, right, as a concept. Um, you know, what some feminists, and that's maybe putting it on a little bit too much on the nose, but I've read some feminist criticism, right, of the idea of literally birthing new ideas, right, kind of taking that metaphorical stance into a more literal one. But you can maybe think about that in your own right. Does this all make sense to everyone, right? Does this kind of track in some way, shape, or form? Yeah. Okay. Um, Now, the methods that feminists actually take in being literary theorists can be rather broad, right? Um, I, in my notes, kind of brought it down to 4 general models that I could think of off the top of my head, but I'm sure if you thought about it, you might come up with a different approach, and that's totally fine as well. But I'm just doing it for the sake of this, brief lecture. Um, a lot of feminist literary theorists will take what I just mentioned, right, the biological approach, right? How is the concept of woman, which obviously has changed over centuries, right? People perceive of what that is to be very different, right? So how is that biologically constructed in the reality of the literature, right, that's being studied? And this is something that you can probably actually think of in the stories that I asked you to read for today. There's also the linguistic perspective that a lot of feminist theorists also take, right? What kind of language is used to describe certain figures, right? A really basic example, right? I remember some analyses showing how certain objects were given what are considered to be more masculine adjectives, right? So, for example, a bridge in English and French, if you were to ask people, they're often associating bridges with what are considered like typically masculine traits, right? Sturdy, strong, right? Massive, right? That kind of stuff. Whereas something like, I don't know, yeah, something like a fountain, right, was considered, was often associated in certain languages with traits that were broadly considered to be more feminine, right? And that's where a linguistic, right, feminist literary theorist might come in and say, like, hey, notice these differences, right? Why is this something that's being constructed in the way that it is in our language, right? These are two just very rapid examples. I'm sure you can find better ones as well. Right? Just to bring it back to some of the perspectives that we've taken before, psychoanalysis, right, has been a shockingly good breeding ground for feminist thought, right? Which some people might actually be surprised by, right? Considering how someone like Freud has kind of been the subject of a lot of criticism for exactly that reason, right? And yet, a lot of feminist theorists, right, have actually gone on to examine the workings of the psyche and how they tend to be or reinforce certain patriarchal norms, right? Again, not just in terms of conscious behavior, right, of actual domination, but unconscious behavior, which is where the psychoanalytic perspective comes in, right? Liam, you were talking about making jokes earlier, right? Sometimes that can, I'm someone who tends to make jokes, right? So I think you probably understand the same thing, but sometimes you just do them automatically, right? Without thinking, right? You just kind of make jokes. Unconsciously, it kind of blurts out, and you realize after, like, oh, maybe that was not the best joke to make in that context, right? So that's kind of, that might be one perspective where the unconscious can be a depiction of how certain patriarchal norms can be perpetuated, right? And of course, to tie it in with our perspective that we took last week, right, which was Marxist literary theory, that has also been a surprising breeding ground for a lot of feminist thought, right, who consider issues of class and cultural struggle and ideological struggle, which are very Marxist concerns, right, alongside the concerns of women, right? Why are we put in the position, or I say we, why are women put in the position of a type of inferior class, right, in certain societies, in a way that's akin to the way that a Marxist might perceive the working class as being a subclass, right? Or what are the relations between the two? Hi, Maiva. So yeah, all of this to say that there's plenty of perspectives that can be had from this type of literature. And like I said, I kind of forgot to put up the questions themselves, right, or the broad questions if you wanted inspiration for that in the future. But I'll try to remember it before I leave for the weekend. The last thing I want to end on before we take a quick break, just to bring it back fully. Actually, no. Do I take a break now? Yeah, I think I'll take a break now because it'll make more sense before we actually go on to the Bloody Chamber. So before we do, does anyone have any questions or concerns? Okay, cool. Come see me if you do. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Bloody Chamber at the very least. And if we have time, the Dirty Little Girl. Okay. So yeah, take a 10-minute break or so and come back after that. Maiva, do you want to?
Because I wasn't present the last 2 weeks, it's a bit rough, so if you will turn back the mute, please.
Yeah.
I came today, but spent too much time. Thank you.
Let me know if you do have any questions about it. Shall we get started again, or? Cool. Okay, so did we all have a chance to read The Bloody Chamber for this week? I'm sorry? You're not done. Okay. Did you read enough of it? Okay, cool. Who wants to give me a short plot summary of what exactly the story is? Because it's not that complicated of a story, like at its core, right? Like the baseline idea. Yeah, I mean,
The girl gets married to someone, and she, like the husband, like on their honeymoon, like goes away, and he tells her to like she can use all the keys except for one.
Yeah.
Like, she's not allowed to go into one room, but she still goes in and finds out like it's the Bloody Shepherd, and there's like a lot of dead bodies.
yeah.
And she becomes like part of it.
Yeah. Does she become part of it?
Oh wait, oh yeah, she doesn't. She almost becomes part of it.
Almost. Yeah. Good. Okay. So yeah, basic plot summary. Thank you very much. Woman marries who exactly? What's his position? Does he know? He has a title. A French marquis. Which, in most stories would be a French marquis, but in this one, obviously, horrendous. Yeah, French marquis. I think actually, I've heard some people pronounce it marquis in English.
I know
Terrible.
because I my engagement.
So good for you. But yeah, okay, so marquis. Yeah, and does she have a name in the story?
Beautiful teenage.
Yep, pretty much, right? Hold on to that thought, right? About whether or not she has a name. He has a title. Does he have a name? He doesn't either, but at least he has a title, so there's that, right? His name is actually kind of implied, though. And by implied, I mean you kind of need to understand the reference. Does anyone know what story this is a rewriting of? Yeah. Bluebeard, right? Is that what you're going to say, Maeva? Have you read Bluebeard before, either of you? Yeah? Okay. Yeah.
Written but the stories after the Bible was fairy tale, and it all started with the Grimm brothers, and then some French authors like
Bill, yeah. Yeah.
and Bluebeard was one of the most rewritten fairy tale,
Yeah.
and each version has their let's say gruesome but interesting twist, especially that fairy tales were movies. What we found shocking from nowadays point of view is that fairy tale has such a gruesome ending just to teach kids what to do or what to not do, and if they don't follow the rule because their societal rules, only drastic and tragic endings awaits them, which me personally almost make me think about most of the theatrical Greek Latin mythology ends in tragedy.
Yeah, hold on to that thought. We might come back to that one. Liam, did you have anything you wanted to add about Bluebeard?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
Like this, like it's really big, the red lighting, it's perfect.
Yeah, good. But yeah, I like that idea, or at least that mention of fairy tales being morality tales, right? Or cautionary tales at the very least, right? Don't go into a forest because a witch is going to bake you into her pie, right? Which sounds funny, right, when I say it like that, but is utterly terrifying if you're 5 years old and hearing that, right? And, it was a valid and probably successful way of getting kids not to actually go into forests, right? I know if I was told not to go somewhere because a witch might eat me when I was a kid, I would probably not go to that place, right? I'm almost 30 and I would probably not do that today, right? So I do think there is a validity to those kinds of stories, right? And I do also like the idea that, or at least what my value raised as this tendency with the Grimm brothers or Charles Perrault or other writers to want to collect these fairy tales, right, into books, which was a tendency that was, happening in the 18th and 19th century, right, as as the world was industrializing, right, people were realizing that traditional stories or tales were being slowly lost as the world was kind of flattening out, right? And everyone had either the same books that were being sold to them, just to bring it back to the stories, or the same clothes, the same types of houses, and so on and so forth. And so, the Grimm brothers were very much responding to something like that, right? Saying, like, these stories are what make us human in many ways, right? Or the Grimm brothers had a more explicitly nationalist perspective, right? They're what make us German, right? Which is also perhaps interesting to consider. But right, there was this tendency to want to collect these stories so that they weren't lost to time, right? And it is quite notable that someone like Angela Carter in The Bloody Chamber is perpetuating, right, this action or this praxis of picking up stories where they had been left perhaps to the past and telling us again and again why they might be important, right? Obviously, as some of you mentioned in your review of the text, this was a story that was written in the 1970s, right? 1971, 72 when it was published, early 70s. And so this was still very much a concern for a lot of feminists, right? Are we actually safe? And, as some of your answers at the beginning of class highlighted, that's still a concern, right? To a lot of women today, right? Will I be safe if I go out with this person, right? And so what Angela Carter is doing in reviving or retelling the story of the Bloody Chamber with a more modern or contemporary twist to it, it is very much emphasizing the importance of these kinds of fairy tales and morality tales, which is something that, as a writer, she does a lot, right? She's very interested in the fairy tale, right, as an idea, as a concept, which is why I put magical realism right at the top here. It's a genre that takes up a lot of tropes of the fairy tale, or the idea that there's a little bit of magic, right, in the real world, hence the term magical realism. And it's something that Carter really embraces. If you're interested in reading more of her work, there's what's it called? The Magic Toy Shop, I think it's called. It's a book-length story, which has a similar vibe to The Bloody Chamber, right? And actually similar feminist concerns as The Bloody Chamber, that make it a rather good companion piece, even though we didn't necessarily have time to read it in this class specifically, right? And yeah, one of the things I want to bring up, right, in relation to the fairy tale, is the third question here. We'll come back to freedom of discourse, which we'll see if I have time, but I think it's kind of cool. Yeah, so generally speaking, right, when we think of fairy tales, how does a typical fairy tale story go, especially where marriage is concerned, right, as this type of story? What do we imagine when we say a marriage fairy tale, right? Or a wedding fairy tale? Hell, we still use the term a fairy tale wedding, right? What comes to mind when we think of that? Does the Bloody Chamber come to mind? No. Happy ending, right? They lived happily ever after, right? Just think of the Cinderella story, right? Literally a fairy tale in this case, right? With a happy ending. Bad stuff happens to Cinderella, of course, right? She can't fit her slipper, right? Horrible for an aristocratic woman to not be able to wear her shoes properly. And she gets turned, no, her carriage gets turned into a pumpkin or some shit. Right? So there's bad stuff that happens, but at the end of the day, she gets to marry Prince Charming. Right? Same thing with, what's the other one? Snow White. Yeah, Snow White, right? She goes through her whole thing. She gets lost in the woods. She finds the 7 dwarves, and at the end, right, Snow White has her Prince Charming, right? Beauty and the Beast, right? Modern. The original version is a little bit darker than the contemporary version, but it goes to show, right, how even in the more contemporary time, we have a tendency to want to make these stories a little bit lighter, right? So the Beauty and the Beast becomes less dark and more of like, hey, you can find true love despite, someone's inner beast, right? And then they ruined it with the Emma Watson version, which is probably one of the worst things I saw that year. Yes, Maeva. Yeah.
She's really like simple and
Yeah.
I think it was the original one.
Yeah.
The dark one. Out of the 2 other songs.
Lovely. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But this just first hit the Cinderella, the Judy, the stepsisters, whatever.
Yeah.
Cinderella, the original one of her stepsisters lost toe.
Yeah.
The other one lost her her heel.
Not the heel.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, to fit in the shoes. Yeah. So they are certainly darker, absolutely. But at the end of the day, right, the story ends with the happy ending of like true love, right, is actually found, right? To again pull from Shakespeare, right? They find true love's kiss and so on and so forth, right? Which, by the way, is what Shakespeare is kind of laughing at, is this fairy tale ending. People tend to forget that Romeo and Juliet is a parody and not something that was meant to be, right, a super romantic West Side Story type of story. So good. This might seem like an obvious question, but I think it's a good one to get us like fully started into the story. How does the Bloody Chamber actually play with this idea of the fairy tale, right? So there is the version, right, that we talked about in the plot, right? The guy is not Prince Charming. He's quite literally the opposite of Prince Charming, right? He murders women. But are there other ways that Angela Carter kind of plays with the expectations that we have of fairy tales? Perhaps in the language, or perhaps in like what happens to her. So just to come back to our question number 3 here. So how does the Bloody Chamber play with our expectations of the fairy tale, right? So on the one hand, as we've already mentioned, there's the Marquis who's a murderer and not Prince Charming, but what else? Yeah. Okay.
The damsel's chance when the big hero guy comes to save her.
So on the one hand, right, the mother is not the evil stepmother that you would expect, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the cute starts. That's where it starts with the wedding.
Yeah, good. I think that's a really good one as well, right? And they get married and it's happily ever after, right? That's how a lot of fairy tales end, right? It's up to your imagination as the reader or listener or watcher to say, oh, yes, they had, the greatest life ever, right? They went to France every year and enjoyed lovely wine, right, at the top of the Eiffel Tower. It was magical. And you're right? Angela Carter instead picks up on that and says, no, right? It was not a fairy tale wedding, right? It was anything but. Okay. Let's push this thought further. Why would she be interested in the 70s, right, of picking up on this idea of an unhappy marriage, right? Why would that be a concern that she wanted to bring up? This might require a little bit of like historical knowledge here, so I'm curious. It's okay if you don't necessarily have. So they were starting to be. That's the thing, yeah. Yes, yeah. Well, by the 70s, we're more into like second wave, fully. Yeah, absolutely, right. So now we're fully into second wave, and your two answers kind of tie in together very explicitly. I brought in labor issues as one of the ways that second wave feminists kind of express themselves, right? But another one was actually being concerned with who they married, right? For a long time, and as was mentioned in some of your responses earlier, some people still don't have, right, a choice as to who they marry, right, in their life. One of my good friends actually is in an arranged marriage, for example, right? So it is something that's still very common, right, in many parts of the world. And yet, what a lot of North American feminists, which Carter certainly was, I say was, I'm not sure if she's dead or not, was, I don't know, right? Which Carter was channeling at the very least at the time, is this idea of, right, marriage being perhaps something that is not as idyllic as we thought it was, right? Obviously taking it into horrible circumstances, right? But still very much thinking through this, this idea. Any other ways that there's a subversion of the fairy tale? So picking up from the ending. I certainly think like you raised, the two main ones, but go ahead, Minhee. Yeah, that's Maimuna brought that one up. So she's saved by her mother at the end. Absolutely.
Usually they end up with like the pristine, like Prince.
Yeah. Right. So the piano tuner, right? Okay, let's just take Red Riding Hood. I guess Red Riding Hood is a good example. The Hunter does kind of is kind of a good one, but we tend to imagine, right, non-aristocratic, right, figures in fairy tales as being, right, the lower class, rough and tumble. They're the evil part, right, of the story, usually, right, and it's kind of flipped on its head here, right? The aristocrat is the evil one, piano tuner less so, right? Absolutely. So there's a class dynamic that's happening here, right? Kind of flipping that on its head as well. Good. Very good. Anything else? Yeah. Okay. Maeva and then Nia. Yeah. Oh, she is dead? Oh, no. When did she die? Okay. Oh, wow. I was way off. Okay. Like 30 years ago. Whoops. All right. Nia, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So that brings us to the last one, right? How does Carter explore the connection between sexuality and violence, right? So usually in a lot of tales, there's very little sexuality, right? At least it's implied more than actually explicitly stated, right? Mostly because of the morality element to it. Again, they were meant usually for children, right? And so the happily ever after does fall into that category of like the implied, right? We don't know what happens to them, but traditionally that would mean, well, they have plenty of children, right? Or they live fulfilling lives as aristocrats. But we never explicitly get a scene of like they boinked all night and had like 15 children or whatever, right? So the sexuality part in a lot of fairy tales is very much left unsaid, right? Or unspoken in a lot of them. So how does she kind of play with that, right? So she does tend to associate violence and sexuality in this story. Does anyone have any examples of how she does that, right? And I say that, and I have some examples here, but you can maybe take a minute to look through the story. Are there any explicit connections here between sexuality and violence? Where is it? Yes. Okay, good. I have one example that I noted. It's relatively early on in the story. Yeah, go ahead.
Is like filled with like a collection of like the pornographic engravings.
So there's absolutely that. Do you have a specific page? Okay. Okay. So yeah, the pornographic elements, right? Absolutely. Generally, right? This is not going to be a class on pornography as a whole, but like generally speaking, I don't think I'm teaching you anything new by saying that pornography has tended not to be particularly favorable towards women and like actually being treated with kindness in any way, shape, or form. It has tended as an industry to be rather racist, misogynistic, and rather violent. Yeah.
Would you say the fact that the three other wives have the white lilies, and then he also had the same white lilies in the room where they consummated their marriage? There's like a correlation there.
Think this through, and then I saw your hand, Francesca. But yeah, what would be the correlation there?
Same flowers.
Yeah.
Whether it's to, I guess, like showcase his accomplishment in killing, or his accomplishment by consummating his marriage.
So very much, right, the idea of associating the literal death of his previous wives, right, with, the sexual conquest of his new wife in this case, right? There's probably some kind of analysis that we can make here of how in French we refer to orgasms as la petite mort, right? In some way. I haven't thought about this in any way, shape, or form, so I'm not going to talk about it for like 10, 15 minutes, but that's maybe something that you can talk about if you decide to talk about the bloody chamber in your essay. That might be something. Francesca, you had your hand up.
She looks in a mirror. I think she refers to herself as like her own potential for corruption when she sees how innocent she looks and the carnal way in which the Marquis looks at her.
Yeah. The carnal way that he looks at her, I have that on the 9th page, personally. He stripped me, gourmand that he was, as if he were stripping the leaves off an artichoke. But do not imagine much finesse about it. This artichoke was no particular treat for the diner, nor was he yet in any greedy haste. That's one example that I had, but throughout the story, you do definitely get like the idea, not only the association of her as a kind of food to be eaten and consumed, but his gaze, right, as being something that you look at. But the mirror part is really interesting. I brought it up in question number 4, right? What role do objects play, right? Mirrors definitely play a big part in the story. So you get his gaze, but you also get her gaze on herself, right? Do you notice anything in how she refers to herself when looking in the mirror versus his gaze? Yeah.
The way that she recognizes her own potential for corruption kind of shows that she's kind of playing a part in her own objectification bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I have a passage here. Is it on 30? Yeah. It's very much towards the end, right? It's on page 30. I know there's no pages, but on the PDF, right? So it's 7 pages from the end. Right, where she writes, I forced myself to be seductive. I saw myself pale, pliant as a plant that begs to be trampled underfoot. A dozen vulnerable, appealing girls reflected in as many mirrors, and I saw how he almost failed to resist me. Right. So there's this weird contradiction, right, in passages like that I think you're raising quite accurately with the use of mirrors, where she kind of sees herself almost alongside in a similar way that he sees her, right? She sees herself as the other girls, right, who have also been killed and so on. And yet there's something implied as a resistance in the very first sentence of that passage. I forced myself to be seductive, right? It's not something that she actually wants, of course, but that necessity dictates that she be in order to survive perhaps a little bit longer, right? Good. Any other connections between sexuality and violence that we noticed before we move on to other questions? I'm just going to look at my notes to see. Yeah.
But like, maybe not schools, maybe I don't say in Canada, but like in maybe third world countries that are historically speaking, the like all the importance that people put in virginity for like women. That if a woman wasn't a virgin, then she was not pure anymore.
Good.
And so I guess for realizing like going to the bloody chamber and seeing all these dead women, and realizing that oh now she's not a virgin, she's like kind of making a link how now she's not worthy, so she was killed. And realizing that like oh now that's my future because I'm not a virgin.
Like I served my purpose, right? Quote unquote purpose, and now die, right? Like I'm going to die. And how does that tie into Sudeshna, right? Your point of flowers and white flowers. Well, how does that tie into what Maimuna just said about virginity and purity and death?
Say a virgin, pure virgin is called a white flower. Deflowering.
Literally deflowering, right? Losing your virginity, right, is a term that's used. Yes, Maiva. Yeah.
Language of the flowers, and so the flowers as a representation, and white uses the sign of purity and happiness and innocence as well, and mostly sometimes associated to adolescence and youth.
Yeah.
And so when we get the flower, as you said, it's like there's no beauty, no qualities to read about this.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah. And then I saw your hand, Mia. You can see this all the time, especially in poetry. That comes up a lot. The flower imagery to talk about like beautiful women or anything like that. That comes up all the time, right? Less so in contemporary poetry, but like typically speaking, you see it all over the place. And yeah, absolutely. You can also, right, just to bring it back to the ecofeminist perspective, right, associating women's virginity with the natural beauty of flowers and so on. There's, again, a million things that you can kind of unparse out of that. Mia, you had your hand up, and then Sue.
Funeral flowers?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's good.
I thought that was interesting. Like it was the marriage from the first.
Oh, that's really good. I didn't even pick up on the lily thing. Oh, yeah. Nice. Yeah, so lilies typically tend to be a funeral flower. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Until it looked like an embalming parlor, so like a morgue.
Of course. Yeah, that's really nice.
That's all I'm trying to say. I had to. Do you think the choker is also a representation of sexuality and violence? And also, when you put the choker on her and they consummate their marriage, he kisses the choker before he kisses her.
Okay,
I think, I don't know, something about that is just off.
good. What page are you on, roughly?
Page 9, but.
9. Yeah. Um, 9.
It's when they're about to do it.
Yeah.
He made me put on my choker, the family hero of one woman who escaped the blade.
I'm just looking for the passage here. What's the start of the paragraph? Like, how does it begin? Oh, okay, that's how it begins. I'm just looking because it might be slightly off. Ba. What's that a reference to? All the better to see you. Red Riding Hood. Good. All the better to see you, my dear. Right. Terrible voice. Anyway. But yeah, okay, good. So the choker. Choker comes up quite a bit, right? In the story. Where's the first mention of the choker? And then I'll come back to your point because I think it's a good one. Yeah, right at the start. Yeah, Mia, is that what you're going to say? Okay.
Talks about the story of the Tripper and how it's his grandmother after the revolution, the aristocrats that escaped like the guillotine, they would wear red like ribbons, like an ironic fashion kind of thing. And the revolution decided to have a movie instead of the
Yeah. When you say the revolution, what revolution are you referring to, and what's the good French Revolution? I say that because like the guillotine was used technically in a lot of revolutions, but yeah, good. So the French Revolution, which is the broad context of the story in this case, and so yeah, there's the irony, right, of wearing a choker around your neck, right, a red choker symbolizing right blood or the head being cut off, right.
In a passage, she says, "The choker boobies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat."
Yeah, exactly. Good. So already, right, the association here, beauty and her death or her demise in this case. Why does he kiss the choker first? Or I pointed to Yusu because you raised the passage, but anyone can.
Also got a chance to wear it, and they're all dead.
So so what does that have to do with it?
I mean, how they were killed when you're swimming with really religious throat, and so he kind of it's like reminiscing the murder of the other 3 women, that's the other wives. I find he's gonna probably do it to her too eventually.
Yeah. Again, and then I saw you with Andy. Carter was a professional writer, right? She knew what she was doing, and so dropping these hints, right, thematically and otherwise, of literally admiring the symbol of death, right, that's on her neck before her, associating the flowers and all of that. This is not coincidence, right? As far as Carter is concerned, she's very much laying the groundwork for the admiration, right, of death and this particular or this new wife. Yes, Aya, you had your hand up.
Chokers somewhat symbolizes like the entrapment and the woman to catch on fire.
Vulnerable, yeah.
Like the
Vulnerability, yeah.
this woman is married, so I think he kisses that first because that's what he's actually after in the marriage, to tell the woman, and that necklace that's like specifically like represents that.
Yeah. I mean, there's on the surface level, right? It's literally called a choker, right? In this case, right? It's not necessarily known for being anything but constrictive. I've never worn a choker, but I can't imagine it would be particularly comfortable to have something like that close to your neck at all times. But yeah, absolutely, right? There's, if you want to think of it symbolically, it's something that has, no particular end to it. It's kept around your neck at all times. Yeah, very good, right? Anything else? Yeah, maybe. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Yeah. So on the literal level, right, a choker as dominance. Yeah.
Engagement ring, which my old nurse who still lived with my mother and me squinted at the ring asking, opals are bad luck, she said. But this opal had been his mother's ring, his grandmother's, and even her mother's before that, given to an ancestor by Catherine de' Medici. Every bride that came to the castle wore it time out of mind. And did he give it to his other wives and have it back from them? So it's like kind of raising, the red flags.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, right, I like that, right? Did he give it to his other wives and have it back from them? Immediately at the start of the story, right? We're a page and a half in and there's already, right, these questionings, right? That come not only for us as readers, right, who would probably question, right, why he had gone through so many wives beforehand, but in the actual story itself, the main character does actively question that, which again kind of subverts a lot of storytelling expectations, right? For fairy tales and otherwise, right? Our expectation of the fairy tale would be that the bride comes in and she expects it to be idyllic, right? And then something happens that kind of slowly starts to make that crumble. But already, to come back to that, for first question that we addressed, there's questioning that that nothing is as it seems, right? Or at least very few things are as it seems. Very good. Did anyone look up Catherine de' Medici? Right? And yeah, go ahead. I didn't personally. I'm just curious. As I read the passage, I'm like, oh, she might have been interesting to look up, and yeah, the name rings a bell. Yeah, for her.
Says, Kathleen de Medici has inspired a novel that was called La Miseria del Passé.
Okay.
I'm not sure I don't want to begin.
Yeah, I don't. Ba, 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 ba. She was blamed for the persecutions carried out under her son's rule, in particular the St. Bartholomew Days massacre. Oh, lovely woman. Some historians have excused Catherine from blame for the worst decisions of the crown. Okay, so seemingly not a fantastic ruler, right? I'm not going to read a Wikipedia page here in front of you, but there's, again, probably a reason why she raised Catherine de' Medici specifically, right? And that might be worth looking into, even if we won't necessarily take the time to do that here. Yes. Yeah.
Corrupt and consolidated power at a high level.
How did they consolidate power at a high level? Yeah. Usually it's through institutional violence or religious violence. If you ever wonder how someone got to power in a major position of power, that's likely the two options throughout most of history is you killed someone or you are friends with someone who's in power. That's just my cynical dropping for today. Just a cynical idea for today. Okay. Any other objects? So we talked about mirrors, jewelry, the keys. We referenced it specifically. Why might that be important? Why keys? Right. Obviously, they play a role in the actual unlocking, right? But let's think unlocking of doors. But let's maybe push that a little bit further. Why thematically it might be important. Assuming
cheaper, to get into a room, you need a key, and she's also close to going to the room. So the key is what stands between her and the secret.
Yeah, good. So on a literal level, right? It's a small object that has such big influence. I mean, is that what you were going to kind of raise, or? Yeah, please.
She also started that she dropped the key into full blood. She doesn't want her husband to find out, so she tries to wash off the blood, but it doesn't wash off. Then later on, he imprints that blood onto her forehead.
Yeah.
And
doesn't come off. And like at the end of this whole story, like she says that it just like never comes off, and she's glad that the piano tuner guy is blind because like it spares her shame.
Good. Okay. So there's a literal blood stain. What does that make us think of? To come back to Maimuna's point of religion? Yeah.
Briefly, they mentioned the mark of Cain.
Okay. Yeah. The mark of Cain. And has anyone who here has ever gone to a baptism? No, no one's ever attended a baptism. Yeah. Yeah. Good. So a part of the baptismal ceremony is taking holy water and putting a sign of the cross, right, on usually a baby, but whoever is getting baptized, right, is put that, right. So there's kind of like a perversion in this case of baptism. Maeva, you had your hand up.
Simple objects has a lot of sexual connotation, and in this case, the key is one of them.
Why?
For the keys and like some ocean creatures has those types of sometimes has sexual connotation. The key will be more of the phallic element, and for example. I forgot the name of the creature, I think oyster or
Yeah, conch shell. Yeah. Uh-huh. Good, right? There's the literal level, right? A key being a rather phallic symbol, right? What do you literally do with a key? You penetrate it through a hole, right? Super crude way of putting it, but like that's quite literally what you do with a key in this case. So on some level, yeah, you can absolutely interpret it as a kind of phallic symbol. Francesca, you had your hand up, and then Maimuna.
So they do reference the mark of Cain.
Yeah.
According to Wikipedia, the mark of Cain is God's promise. Oh, wait, no, not that. Well, it's to provide divine protection from premature death.
Yeah.
So that too is kind of foreshadowing that she's gonna survive.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Because who's Cain? And yeah, okay, Cain and Abel, but what's Cain's role specifically in like biblical history? He's the first murderer. Yeah, good. He's a murderer. Yeah. So in biblical tales, right, he's the first murderer. But yeah, absolutely. They reference the mark of Cain, and thematically, right, that might ring to at least people who are aware of that story, saying like, oh, okay, it's a bit of a hint that she might be protected from, what faced the other women. Absolutely. Good. Yeah, sure, we can talk about the keys. Keep going. What? Broadly, but not really.
Stories involved.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
You also think of it as like a division.
Mhm.
If we look at it through like the fairy tale mindset,
Yeah.
there's always like a thing that happens before like the visualistic girl like enters like the new world or discovers X-rays and everyone. And I guess the keys in that sense are like the object that makes her enter the new world and like progressing the plot. So it's like a division that's like forbidden and lost, and then she has like
Yeah.
the
I don't think like it's that much of a stretch, right? To have that interpretation, absolutely. Especially when we're dealing with fairy tales or fairy tale adjacent stories like this one, right? Fairy tales are a lot of things, but subtle is not necessarily one of them, right? And so, yeah, on the literal sense, a door is often, a very good representation of like crossing over into another world, right? The most famous example of that being Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, good. Right? She falls into the hole and enters into, Wonderland and meets a high caterpillar and other stuff that happens in that story. Right? Good. Good. Anything else we want to add about objects? Yes, Francesca.
Keys. secrets,
Okay.
and they symbolize knowledge and success.
Yeah. Good. Awesome. I have nothing to add to that. That's just cool. All right. There's one more thing that I want to bring up here, and that's why I put free indirect discourse as the second point. And we're probably going to end on this because I'm seeing time fly, and as I mentioned, I have to leave. Grammar nerds here, what's free indirect discourse? And why does it matter to our broad concern of feminist theory? Yeah, didn't think I was going to bring up grammar in relation to feminist writing, am I right? Anyone know what free indirect discourse is? Yeah.
It's kind of like a narration method where the character's thoughts are blended in with the narrative.
Okay, good. And who popularized that? Do you know? Okay, cool. I'm about to drop some literary history on y'all. So I bring it up because Angela Carter basically uses this quite a bit, right, in this story, where in essence it's a mix of third-person narration and first-person narration, right, where we don't explicitly get, a quotation of a person's thought, right? I thought, quote, what a hottie, end quote, right? Like that would be first person inside someone's thought, right? You're explicitly telling me what you're thinking. Whereas free and direct discourse would be something like, in her mind, there was a terrified thought, right? That would be free and direct discourse, where the narrator uses third person to tell you what's inside a very specific person's mind without actually quoting from that person, right? So I have an example here. This is on page 5. Yeah, around the middle of page 5. So she just explains, right, after the terror in the early days of the Directory, the aristos, blah, blah, blah. So basically goes over a brief history of the French Revolution. And in the paragraph after that, it starts off with basically a long paragraph of free indirect discourse. I saw him watching me in the gilded mirrors with the assessing eye of a connoisseur inspecting horseflesh, and even of a housewife in the market inspecting cuts on the slab. I'd never seen or else had never acknowledged that regard of his before, the sheer carnal avarice of it. And it was strangely magnified by the monocle lodged in his left eye. When I saw him look at me with lust, I dropped my eyes, but in glancing away from him, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, right? And so on, so forth. And on page 7, if we have, so 2 pages later, right? And his castle, the fairy solitude of the place with its turrets of misty blue, its courtyard, its spiked gate, his castle that lay on the very bosom of the sea with seabirds mewing about its attics, the casements opening onto the green and purple, evanescent departures of the ocean, and so on and so forth. So we're getting your thoughts, right, about the castle or about the guy himself, and yet it's never explicitly quoted, right? It is always the narrator or the narration telling us what's inside someone's mind, right? Again, mix of third and first person here, okay? So this is really important, right? And I'll let you marinate onto why, and then tell you, while I tell you why that's cool. Let's see. Well, okay. Who here has read Sense and Sensibility? Yeah, good. Jane Austen, right? Famous novelist, who you should all read at least once in your lifetime because she's rad and cool. Was rad and cool. Is pretty much the one who kicked off the idea of free and direct discourse, right? And there were 2 reasons for this. On the one hand, she was part of what's broadly called the Romantic movement, right? Which as we've talked about in this class before, was very much concerned with expanding, right, what we understand as the mind and how we approach our own thoughts, right, or other people's thoughts. And this is just an example from Sense and Sensibility, right? Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able at all to sleep the first night after parting from Mr. Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. Fucking incredible passage. God, I love Jane Austen. But, right, why does this matter, right? Why am I bringing this up in relation to feminist discourse? Why would Austen kick this off? Why does Angela Carter pick it up in this explicitly feminist text? Why does free and direct discourse matter to what we're discussing now? Yes, Maeva.
Characters normally in literature that
So on the one hand, you're absolutely giving voice, but push that thought further. What kind of voice are we giving to characters, or how are we depicting that voice? Right? Their thoughts. But you can do that in more ways than just free and direct discourse, right? You could have a quotation mark saying, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die, end quote, right? Yeah.
It's like in French, like my teacher says that you omniscient, all seer kind of like God. And by giving like a woman introspective thought that role, that's empowering. That's empowering to her.
On the one hand, absolutely, right? There's a form of empowerment, right? Great. Not only are you capable of thought, duh, right? But it's an omniscient kind of thought, right? A thought that is capable of pulling out, right, from just yourself and going into much broader and much greater categories, right? Absolutely, right? This fits in with what we were talking about psychoanalytically, right? The mind is much more interesting and much more depth worthy than we give it credit for, right? Good. Any other reasons, right, why we might use free and direct discourse?
Competition is that just one of the numerous subjective respects with the people.
Right? Yeah. It's a highly subjective type of writing that appears to be objective, right? Really, really good, right? When you have just a simple quote, right? Open quote, I thought I'm gonna die, end quote. I was gonna die. What you have, right, is explicitly the awareness that this is one person's subjectivity, right? You cannot escape it, that it is their thoughts, right? And yet when you use something like free and direct discourse, you're blurring the line between a objective narrator and a subjective narrator, right? Which I think is really worth highlighting, right? It adds a layer of complexity and contradiction to what might otherwise be a very straightforward type of story. Right? Very, very good. Yes. Okay. Any final thoughts on the Bloody Chamber? Right? Did we like this story, generally speaking? I mean, like, some of you all had at least things to say about it, even if you didn't like it, so that's good. Awesome. So, I know I made you read The Dirty Little Girl, and I usually like to talk about everything that I have you read, but we will not have time to talk about it for today, and for that, I apologize. If you do have like explicit questions about it or anything that like is really pressing, we can bring it up next week. I'm happy to like quickly talk about it if you really want. Next week, focus on Bloodchild. Is it next week that I asked you to read Bloodchild? Yeah. Presence is a good story. I think Bloodchild is more interesting and has more to like unpack with it. So if you only have one to choose, focus on Bloodchild. But Presence, I think, is really good too. So we'll hopefully get to it. Yeah, reach out with any questions. But otherwise, thank you for this shortened class. It was good, and I'll see you all next week. Have a good weekend.